to this RF event, Restoration Fellowship. Focus on the kingdom.org is our other website. This is the humanjesus.org, because today I have a long awaited guest, a person I have been trying to get on here for, I don't know, 5 years, ever since we met, I think. So he is Patrick Navas. He is the author. Some of you might know this book, and if you do not know this book, you have to get this book. This was one of the books I read as a Christian. I've only been a Christian for, 12 years or so. But this is one of the big books that really got my my faith going. And so I'm very happy to have Mr. Patrick Navas on here, and we'll bring him up. Patrick, can you hear me? Are you there?
Yes.
All righty. Thank you. Thank you. I must say this story before we start. So I am in Sydney, Australia, of all places. As some of you might know from my story, I grew up agnostic. So I'm 32 years old and I come to the faith. I start reading the Bible, first time in my life in those 32 years. And Sydney, Australia is very, secular place. It's a very European, and there's not much going around in terms of religion or churches. Anyway, so I quickly, naturally came to the so-called one God belief. And I studied the Trinity for months because people told me that God was three persons in one and all this stuff. And so I looked at it, I examined it because I didn't know any better. I'm a, newbie, as they say. And I don't even remember, Patrick, maybe you do, how I came to your book, but all I remember was do you recall anything at all?
I honestly don't remember. I know we've been in touch for many years, but I don't recall how we first came in contact. I did publish my email in the back of the book, and throughout the years, quite a few people have contacted me. I made quite a few friends that way as well, so I'm glad I did that.
Well, I think that's what happened, but I was trying to remember where I saw your book, and I think it probably was from the CES people, the Christian Educational Services people, the truthertradition.com.
Yes, I remember that.
So that's another non-Trinitarian group here in the States, and I think they quoted you or something like that. Anyway, and I start hunting down this book, and I was you have quite an appealing cover to the book as well. And I like the title, and I'm like, okay, this sounds it. Anyway, I found it downtown Sydney in a theological library, one of the few theological libraries. They had this book on their shelves, and I couldn't borrow it because I was not a student. I believe it was Moore College in Sydney, if I remember, and it was their library, and you could only go in there as a visitor, but I couldn't borrow it. And yes, you're right. I saw the email at the back of the book. I emailed you, and I said, "Can you send me you remember? Can you send me a PDF? Because I can't get your book here, and it's so expensive online." And you were very gracious. You sent me the copy and I devoured the book, and here we are. And then we met in 2008. If you remember, I was in LA going through. Again, you were very gracious. You came down. Remember, you drove down to where I was. You picked me up.
I do remember that.
And yeah. So thanks for being here. Let's see. So I'm going to try and get some questions to us. You can both ask us questions, by the way. So the topic is, does the preexistence issue, so, this whole notion that Jesus preexisted literally, does it undermine Jesus' humanity? But first of all, Patrick, please tell us more about yourself for people who might not know how you came to the faith, your influences, and so on, please.
Okay, well, long story short, I first came into contact with the scriptures as a freshman in high school. That's at least the earliest memory I have of being very captivated by what I had read in the text of one of those pocket New Testaments, the Gideon New Testaments, that somehow I got a hold of one. And I remember reading John 3:16, and that had enormous impact. It sort of ignited my interest to learn more about that message. So I just began to read that copy of the New Testament that I had. And not too long after, I had association with different kinds of churches, evangelical churches. I studied with Jehovah's Witnesses for a few years through my mom. She actually had a study, like a weekly study that she engaged in through their door-to-door ministry. So I began to learn about Jehovah's Witnesses and their beliefs. And also, I had some influence from the LDS church through my dad's side of the family. My grandmother, she converted to the LDS church long before I was born. So I sort of grew up having exposure to them as well and their beliefs. And but I was always just captivated by the scriptures. I don't recall any one particular person that had a strong influence on me. I was more captivated by Jesus as he was presented in the scriptures, and just reading the text for myself. And obviously at one point I became exposed to I think a lot of it came about through being exposed to the claims of evangelicalism in contrast with what Jehovah's Witnesses were saying, and along with my own independent studies, I started to realize that there was a big difference between the traditional doctrine of the Trinity and what Jehovah's Witnesses were saying. And I began to read literature, a lot of apologetic literature that attempted to refute the Jehovah's Witness non-Trinitarian view. And at least from what I remember, that's what sort of compelled me to just take my research to an even deeper level, and to start putting together my own written articles on a variety of subjects. And so that's what I recall. It's been quite a long time. I'm 41 now, so I think I first read the New Testament when I was about 16 or 17, somewhere around there. So once I started to put together sort of a collection of research and writings that I had composed, I just came away with the idea that I might be able to put it together in a book. And that's what ultimately happened. I think the first edition was published in 2007, is the one that you had posted. And then I revised it and I republished it again with a different subtitle in 2011. And now looking back, I actually kind of think the book is a little bit longer than it has to be. So I've received a lot of positive reviews of the book, and I've seen some say that it's a little bit repetitive. And I think it's close to like 600 pages. So I think looking back, I'd make it a little bit shorter.
So how old were you when you got the idea, and how old were you when you finally were able to publish it?
I must have been I published it when I was 27. So I think I probably started writing when I was like 25 or so. And so, yeah, it's been in publication ever since.
Wow. I mean, this book is, let me see, 576 pages.
Yeah.
It actually says December 19, 2006, Patrick.
Okay, 2006
Wow.
then.
So you were in your 20s, man. I mean, I can't, I struggle to this day. I'm 45 now to write a little script for my sermonette Sunday mornings. But you definitely have a knack for writing. I found your book fascinating, easy to read. Again, I highly recommend the book. And look at this, is so funny because next to it, you see what's next to it?
Yeah.
When did you, if you remember, and I think we're going to have Sir Anthony on here to talk to us a little bit, if you don't mind.
Oh, no.
When did you come to this book?
Good question. I can't recall exactly. I definitely read it. I think it was actually recommended to me by a Jehovah's Witness guy who had his website, and he had like a collection of resources, if I recall. And I did read it. I still have it in my library.
Right.
And incidentally, I do remember Anthony's book being my first exposure to the view that did not see, literal preexistence in the scripture and proposed alternative, you could say, interpretations of the relevant text. That was the first time I remember coming across that particular view.
So at the time when you wrote your book, at the time you were fully committed to the pre-existence view, or were you still, working that out?
I think I was, if I recall correctly again, I think I was, I guess you could say I leaned more toward that view, but I was aware and became increasingly more and more aware that there was an alternative way to interpret those texts that I did find to be persuasive to a degree. And another book that had an influence on me was Greg Dybel's They Never Told Me This in Church. And I think I remember reading Buzzard's book for the first time and not seeing that his interpretations of the so-called pre-existence text made some sense to me at the time, but I didn't take it too seriously. But I after reading Greg Dybel's book, and he kind of went into a little bit more detail, explaining a lot of the different texts, like Colossians 1, for example. I remember being very impressed by the way that he interpreted the the creation text, texts that seem to attribute Christ as having a role in the creation of all things, and how he interpreted that to refer not to the Genesis creation, but to what you might call the new creation or the new order of things that God had effected through Christ. And so I remember being even more impressed by the depth in which he went to addressing all the relevant texts. And so I began to take that that alternative way of looking at pre-existence, what many have described as ideal or prophetic pre-existence. I
Right.
came to see, or came to believe, that it represented a very reasonable and defensible approach to all those texts.
Mhm.
And ultimately, it sort of brought me to a viewpoint of what I would call agnosticism on that view. In other words, I sort of saw, and still to this day see, both conclusions as reasonable, defensible, and, at least for me, very difficult, even after all these years, to come to a definitive conclusion on. So I sort of consider myself open to both as possible ways of interpreting all the relevant texts that you're aware of.
Right. So because you're agnostic on this still, this is not a debate as such for our
Yeah.
viewers out there. So I'm not, we're not going to engage in a sort of uh, debate. But my interest in this with you, Patrick, well, I know you first of all personally, although we met once, but we've kept in touch, and I have great love and admiration for you. You have a keen mind. You have a great gift of writing. Um, and obviously as a fellow Christians, right? So, but my fascination with you is that I think you're pretty much, as far as I know, there might be someone I'm missing. I've been in this not very long, but long enough and deep enough, to know most people in the quote game, right? In this, in our business. So, and you're probably the only person that's still on the fence, is still agnostic on this. As you know, you can appreciate this. Most are like me. They're either dogmatically notional or ideal pre-existence, or obviously so-called Aryan or some kind of a pre-existence.
Right.
So I just want to ask you, probe some questions. You sent me a paper earlier today, which I wish I had gotten earlier, but so excuse me if I'm not representing it properly, and you can correct me. But let's see, you say that the pre-existence view is still a possible alternative. So let's look at that. So first of all, what is it? Tell us your definition of that, of the literal, so-called literal preexistence, so people can understand.
So I guess in a nutshell, as you know, there's um, maybe dozens of texts, um, specifically in the Gospel of John, in the writings of Paul. I agree that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the so-called synoptic Gospels, don't seem to have any kind of teaching or any expressions that one can reasonably interpret to mean that Jesus had some type of spiritual heavenly pre-existence. So that's true. And so obviously most of the texts come from the Gospel of John, the writings of Paul, and others. The author of Hebrews, there's several statements that are often interpreted to mean that Jesus literally had a pre-human existence. There's one in Jude that's interesting to consider. And where else? Corinthians, that's Paul. So, but basically, there's as you know, there's quite a number of texts that, at least on the surface, seem to suggest that Jesus had some kind of heavenly existence, a heavenly life prior to him being born as a human being. As you know, John 17:5 is a classic one. So John 1 is obviously an important text that people debate about still. I guess what the problem I have is that I pretty much with all these texts, there seems to be a reasonable case that could be made, for both camps, I guess, if you will. And there's so many ambiguities that are associated with things like how to translate a particular verse, and then you also have to deal with ambiguities relative to textual variants. That becomes an issue. So I guess if you consider just one example I mentioned in the paper, John 1, we've talked about it over the years. But that's a text where you have to consider the issue of how to translate it correctly, and there's disputes about what or how we should render John 1's. Most translations obviously say the word was God. You have quite a few other translations or interpreters that would propose the word was a god. Interestingly enough, I could quote a few in a minute, but David Bentley Hart, he's a very prominent Eastern Orthodox theologian. And he actually published or translated the entire New Testament fairly recently. And he actually, in a separate book called Atheist Delusions, I don't necessarily know if you want me to read the whole quote right now, but he's an example of a Greek scholar who at least says that that John 1, as the word was a god, can be justly translated as a god. So that's an instance where I'd say grammatically it can really go either way, and it's not that I'm saying that the word was a god is absolutely the correct way to understand what John meant. It's just to say that grammatically it can be translated as a god, as many Greek scholars have pointed out, like David Bentley Hart, or as you know, Jason Bedun he's I think a theology professor or professor of religions out of Arizona, and I don't even believe he's a Christian. But and of course, about the New World Translation and a few other translations will lesser known ones will have the word was a god. So I just kind of came to see that it's unfortunately difficult to pin down with complete certainty. At least not at least it's ambiguous to the point where I don't feel completely comfortable taking a hard line position or a definitive conclusion, because I could see how grammatically it can be that. A lot of Greek scholars point out that that's the case. Others dispute that and take a different view and translate as the word was God. But then you have the issue of interpretation, because as you know, Trinitarians typically would accept and advocate for the word was God translation, but they have their own way of interpreting that in harmony with the Trinity. And then someone like yourself who accepts the Word was God, if I understand you correctly, also has a different conclusion on that as well, different interpretation. And so, which strikes me as actually very reasonable. So it just seems very difficult in a case like that, at least in my mind, to sort of rule out the possibility that could be the Word was a God. Seems possible grammatically, as well as what you might call theologically.
Let
And then,
me
sure.
ask you a few questions. So let's stick to the textual criticism of it, right?
Yeah.
Let's stick to the textual nature of the verse, and then I'll ask you about the meaning or interpretation, right? So there are two things at play here: how to translate and
Right.
how to understand it.
Right.
So, as you know, now you said there are other translations out there. Now, this is the Popular Bible Gateway. I don't know, this thing gives, what is that, 20 translations or whatever.
Mhm.
And as far as I know, not one has a God, right? Now you're saying that we know that the JWs have popularized it,
That's right.
but what other, if I may call them legitimate translations, can people go to see that the John 1:1c, as it's called, and the word was God is
Mm.
a God? Um, did you
So
mention another or?
yeah, so there are other lesser known ones. I don't have the list in front of me. I can provide one for you at some point. Um, but at least you do have the New World Translation, and you do have, as I said, uh, quite a variety of scholars, in some cases even Trinitarian scholars, like the Eastern Orthodox New Testament translator David Bentley Hart. He says that it can be justly translated as a God. The Logos was a God. I know that Mackenzie, if you look at Mackenzie's Bible Dictionary, he's a Jesuit Catholic
Mhm.
scholar,
Okay.
and I can provide that to you as well.
Now, I think I saw you write that it's also the natural reading. Am I quoting you correct there? That it's more of a natural reading was a God?
Yeah, I think what I was saying is that it can it's grammatically it's a natural conclusion to come to, especially
Right.
when given the fact that you actually have other grammatical constructions in the New Testament that are, you might say, analogous or parallel.
Right.
Um,
Do
and in
you
that
know
paper,
it,
I provided a few examples.
right. Do you know if this is as far as I know, just off the top of my head, historically,
Mhm.
in the history of translating the New Testament Greek, I don't think it has ever been translated as a God. Would that be accurate? Only
into
until,
into English.
yeah, yeah. So in the history of the English language,
Mhm.
has it ever been translated as a God, or was it only until the New World Translation and others in the modern
Um,
era?
as far as English is concerned, I know that the New World Translation wasn't the very first one to propose that as a translation. I can't remember off the top of my head. There are other sort of lesser known ones, not as popular or widely used, but the New World Translation wasn't the first one. Um, as I mentioned, I was going to say that the Jesuit Catholic scholar of Mackenzie's Bible Dictionary, you may have seen it, but in one of his commentaries in that dictionary, he says that John 1 should be rigorously translated. The word was a divine being, the way he puts it.
Hmm.
And obviously, you have the other translations like Goodspeed's American translation and Moffat's translation that at least have an alternative to the word was God, the traditional translation, and they'll have the word was divine.
What?
Mm.
Why do you think? Now we know that most translations are from Catholic Protestant
Right.
organizations. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so,
So most,
for the most
especially
part.
the big ones like NET, New English Translation. I believe Dr. Daniel Wallace is on the board of that. Obviously, the NIV, Trinitarian. So most of these, legitimate mainstream translations are Trinitarian, right? So
Yeah.
why would they not opt for the a God translation, especially considering that they read this as in the beginning was Jesus and or the Son, and the Son was with God. So I'm just asking you your opinion. Why do you
Oh,
think then they wouldn't go then for the natural quote unquote, interpretation of two persons here?
as why would they not go for a God? Is that what you mean?
Right. So if the verse is
Yeah.
talking about two persons, right?
Mhm.
Why wouldn't they go then for that more what you call natural reading or grammatically possible
Right.
a God uh, reading?
Well, I would say for the most part that from a Trinitarian perspective, that would be a translation that's contrary or antithetical to their own preferred view of God and Christ. That would be one reason why. Um, and classically, Trinitarians would argue that one of the primary reasons to object to such a translation is that if the word was a God, lowercase g, then that would violate the biblical concept of monotheism. In other words, the biblical teaching that there is only one God. So you have one God. If you have a God, well, from the Trinitarian perspective, at least classically, that's a conflict with so-called biblical monotheism, which kind of goes back to the point I made earlier about why I don't think that's necessarily the case, given that you actually do have quite a number of texts that can be cited that use the word God of others. Even the angels of God are described as Elohim, like in Psalm 8:5, and in other texts and in other examples of extra biblical literature where you have in the Jewish and biblical tradition this concept of one most high God. He's the one God, but it still allows for others to be considered gods on kind of a secondary level. Human beings like the king of Israel, most would agree was called God in Psalm 45. And again, if you just think about it logically, the angels of God, as they're presented in Scripture, appear to be divine heavenly beings, um, what you might call lowercase gods. So that would be sort of the point that I would make about John 1, that it's grammatically at least possible, and in terms of I guess what you might call theology, doesn't, in my view, necessitate a violation of the Bible's one God concept.
Right. Not that three persons who are
Hmm.
each God
Hmm.
doesn't violate monotheism, right?
Hmm.
So you got one God, two God, three God, but not three gods, one God. Not that
Right.
formulation does not violate biblical monotheism. I'm being sarcastic, of
Hmm.
course. Let me ask you now about the interpretation. So we have a God here, let's say.
Yeah.
So Jesus pre-existed as a God, which is now you know this question very well. So what was he? Was he an angel? Was he, you know, what's your take to this day on that?
Well, if we assume that that translation or that sense is what John intended, and I'm saying that as an if, because I don't know that he did, and I wouldn't argue dogmatically that's what it means. But if we assume that that's what he meant, then in my mind, the question is answered by, in the text itself. The Logos was a God or a divine being. And that's really all the information we have, at least in that text. And then,
See, that sounds like an angel to me, right?
mhm,
Because you just made the biblical position, right? That angels are called gods,
right,
right? Sometimes Elohim.
right,
They're also called sons of God.
that's right.
So it sounds like he was an angel before he became flesh.
Mhm.
Is that
At least with respect to John 1, I wouldn't, as again, assuming the word was a God is the right sense, then I wouldn't go beyond the language of the text and just simply say that the word was a God or a divine being. But I also have to point out that even if that translation is the correct one, I think as I've mentioned to you before, I don't know if that necessarily necessitates that the word was a God in a literal sense in the sense of being a personal being? In other words, why couldn't it be a case of John personifying the Word as a God? In other words, the Word is not literally a God or a person, but John speaks of the Word sort of poetically or metaphorically, if you will, as a God. In a similar way that the author of Proverbs 8, he describes wisdom, or he personifies wisdom as a, quote, master worker, that was with God at the time of creation. So in other words, even if we establish that the Word was a God is the correct sense, I even think at that point you still have to deal with interpretation. It could mean the Word was a God literally. The Word was a divine being, as in a personal entity, or it could be a case of personification, in my view.
Right. Now,
Mhm.
now, if he was an angel,
Mhm.
obviously a special kind of angel,
Yeah.
right? Would that undermine, that's the question of this
Oh yeah.
of today, would that undermine the humanity of Jesus if he was some kind of a God angel, celestial being?
Right. That's the question. So one, I would point out, as you know, that the word angel itself simply means messenger, and I think most would agree, no matter what your background is religiously, that Jesus was certainly a messenger of God, not necessarily Michael the archangel or Gabriel or the like, but at least in terms of just the basic concept of Jesus being a messenger or an ambassador or a spokesperson for God, I think, and everybody would agree with that. So in that particular sense, generally, I will see a problem with the Son being described as a messenger, angel of God in that sense. But to answer your question, and again, we've talked about it over the years, but I don't necessarily think so. I've never thought that was the case. In other words, when I first started studying the scriptures, and I always thought, at least from the beginning, that the scriptures intended to reveal that Jesus did in fact have this pre-human existence. I never thought about it in that sense. In other words, it never represented a source of tension for me. I never thought that, well, that means he therefore wasn't really a human being when he was on earth, and that somehow compromises the genuineness of his humanity. Because I came to see right away that the scriptures placed a great deal of emphasis on the fact that Jesus was a human being. And I know that's always been a source of concern for you and others that do not believe in the literal pre-human existence of Christ. So I think it needs to be pointed out that at least the particular view, non-Trinitarian literal pre-existence, is very different from the Trinitarian incarnation, which says that God, that is the second person of the Trinity, when he became a man in the incarnation, as classically conceived, as you know, that in this view, God and man sort of were combined in what's called the hypostatic union, so that Jesus is a resulting God-man, 100% God and 100% man at the same time. So that's the classical Trinitarian view, but it's important, I think, to note that the alternative view that we're discussing is much different, because it's not the same thing as saying God became a man and became both at the same time, but rather this divine being that was with God in the beginning, the Logos of John 1, actually became flesh, meaning the Word was a God in this view. And then as it says in 1:14, and the Word became flesh. So in other words, one way of looking at it is that the Word was a God, a divine being at one point in the beginning when the Word was with God, but at this other point, the Word becomes flesh. In other words, the Word in this view ceased being a God, and the Word became a man. The Word actually became a human being, not a God-man in a Trinitarian or any other sense, but an actual human being.
Right. Yeah, you wrote that. You wrote
Mhm.
this would mean that the word cease being a God slash divine being when it says that the word became flesh. Now
Mhm.
it sounds like dying. It sounds like so. I don't want to put words in your
Yeah.
mouth, but what do you mean by the word ceased to be? Is that ceased to exist? What we know as death? I think
Yeah.
you're still
Yeah.
conditional immortality, right? You're
Sure.
still good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, to me, it doesn't sound like that. I think what I mean by that is a change. In other words, a genuine transformation. In other words, the word was one thing or one reality at one point, and then the word became something else. The word was a God in this view, and at another point, the word became flesh. So, in my mind, that would not represent death of any kind, but simply a transformation, if you will, or a genuine change. The word
I
was one thing,
I
became
think
another thing.
we yeah, I think we agreed on the word metamorphosis.
Hmm.
Did we agree on that word?
I think
Metamorphosis?
yeah,
Yeah.
I guess it sounds more like a
Transformation.
transformation, which
Right.
is basically the same thing, right?
Okay, so inherently,
Mhm.
by nature, uh, so this is where the thing what's the saying? The tire meets the road, or the road meets
The
the
rubber meets the road.
whatever. I'm bad
The
at that.
rubber meets the road.
This
I
is
think
where
that's
the
it.
rubber meets the road, because most of us non-Trinitarians, I hope it's most of us, say, okay, wait a minute. So are we really talking about a human Jesus then? Because if this is just a transformed, right, pre-existing
Hmm.
being, and we know, I mean, nature tells us, if not the Bible, but nature tells us how we come to be, right? How humans come to be. We're procreated in the womb. The
Hmm.
virgin birth is clear to me. You know, it says that the
Sure.
Son of God was procreated in the womb of Mary. I think I think that's right. And we have all the prophecies about this one, the Messiah, right? The prophecies going back to Genesis. He has to be from the seed of the woman. He has to be from the loins of David, right? He
Right.
has to be a descendant, a legitimate descendant of David in order for him to sit on the throne. But then that's where the rubber meets the road, right? Because now I don't have that. I have what I would call, and these are my words, an illegitimate claimant. Now I have someone who was not raised from among his brothers. So what's that? Deuteronomy 18,
Hmm.
right? God says to Moses, I will raise what
Hmm.
raise as in, bring up in the onto the scene of human history, as
Right.
Sir Anthony puts it. So what would you say to that, Patrick? That consternation, that vexation, is that a word? I'm vexed I'm vexed by those who say that Jesus, really, my Jesus, my Lord and Savior, is really a transformed, pre-existing angel of some kind.
Hmm. Right.
Right.
I guess it's just a matter of how you look at it. I've never, under that particular way of looking at the scriptures or Jesus, I've never saw that again as a source of tension or a problem, I guess, philosophically, theologically, um, because I don't think that all those things that you say about, uh, Moses in Deuteronomy 18, and God says He'll raise up a prophet like Moses, and how Jesus would be a descendant of David. I just don't see any necessary conflict with that and the idea of literal pre-human existence. Um, and maybe it is a problem. It's just not something that's ever stood out to me personally as a source of conflict. Because, like I said, under that view, the idea is that the Son or the one that was with God, became a man. That's even if it's that view, whether right or wrong, at least the point is that's the view. The view accepts and even emphasizes the humanity of Jesus. In other words, they would say that that's exactly what Jesus became. He became a human being. He was a God, if you will, in the beginning, but he became human, an actual human being. And so, at least I would say that, I mean, those that hold to that view, they're certainly not trying to deny the humanity of Jesus, at least not deliberately. You know, it's not as if you're also, I'm sure, familiar with you know John's first letter, where he writes about those who denied that Jesus had come in the flesh. And he
Right.
describes those as antichrist.
Mm,
And I think most commentators think that John was making a reference to the so-called Docetists, these
right.
sort of proto-Gnostics that saw Jesus not as an actual human being, but as some kind of phantom, if you will, that only appeared to be human. That's where you get the word docetism, to appear or to seem like he was really human, but he wasn't. And so John makes several very strong statements, to contradict those who would make that claim.
Now,
And so,
now let me stop you right there. You hit on a very important passage of scripture. I believe it's 1 John 4.
yeah,
Very strong language, right? Antichrist,
yes,
right? I mean, goodness,
that's
God
right,
forbid.
right.
Okay, let's analyze that a little bit, because Docetism taught that he was like a phantasm, I guess, something like that. He just appeared to
Hmm.
be in the
Yep,
flesh,
that's right.
right? Okay, this is the rubber and the road again thing,
All right.
because again, um, the Jesus that I see in the scriptures, right, in the prophecies, the messianic prophecies, which to me are very clear, again, from almost the Garden of Eden,
Right.
that he's the seed of the woman, a human being, a legitimate claimant to the throne. Anything else to me is like that docetic view. In other words, let me put it this way. Um, a, de a denial of the humanity of Jesus can be also other views, not just docetic views, right? It can also be other views like the one that I am not personally comfortable with, where he is a transformed uh, pre-existent being.
Mm,
Could not that also be because he's not one of us then, right?
yeah,
Hebrew, I believe the book of Hebrews says he was made like us in every single way, so we could relate to him.
sure.
So how can I relate to a pre-existing angel, God, celestial being, whatever you want to call it? What would you say to that?
Right. Well, I would say obviously in that one particular respect, we could not relate to him because none of us were pre-existent, presumably. um, but I mean, there's other points that can be made. I mean, for example, I think even under the virgin birth view, strictly speaking, the view that says he came into existence through divine or supernatural intervention via the virgin birth, you know, uh, no one thinks that somehow disqualifies Jesus from being an authentic human being. That's not the case with any of us. We're all human. None of us were born of a virgin. So Jesus was born in a way unique and set apart from the rest of humankind, but nevertheless, he's still a human being in that view. But my point being is that I think one could, if they wanted to, even make the case against the genuine humanity of Jesus based on the virgin birth concept. In other words, how can he be a true human being if he was born of a virgin? No human being was born of a virgin. But I don't think any of us, look at it that way. So I guess in a similar sense, I guess what I'm saying is that just because Jesus allegedly or may have had a pre-human existence, I just don't see how that necessarily compromises or disqualifies the genuine humanity of Jesus, if that's what the scriptures mean, or if that's what God willed to take place. I just don't see it as a problem. Again, like I said,
Right. Do you see texts like Hebrews? You know this one,
yeah,
but for the sake of the audience,
sure.
do do you see this as a problem to the literal preexistence? So, to which of the angels did he, God, ever say, "You are my son; today I have begotten you"? Now, it, the word "begotten," by the way, I don't like it. It's antiquated English. It's
Mm,
old English. It's to me, it's a better modern day paraphrase would be procreated.
okay.
Uh, I, I'm not sure if you agree with that, but so we know that angels are called sons of God. True, right?
Mm,
But this one is, it says the book of Hebrews, is a procreated son, which is what we all are. True, Jesus is unique in that way. He did not have a father, but nonetheless, through the miraculous power of God, he's procreated
mm,
nonetheless. And then obviously you alluded to earlier to Hebrews 2:5, and it makes sense, right? The world to come, the millennium, right? The he, God, did not subject to angels. So does this pose any issues with this a God, angel God?
I mean, not in my mind. I could see why you might think that it does, but I don't know if it necessarily represents a conflict with that. Um,
What? Why not? I mean,
mhm,
so God never said to any angel, "You are my son. Today I have procreated you, begotten you. Again, I will be a father to him. He shall be a son to me." In this way, in other words, it's defining the sonship of Jesus in relation to God the Father, right?
mhm.
So that so pray tell, how does this not throw a wrench into the literal preexistence of Jesus as some kind of an angel, God,
Yeah,
celestial?
I mean, I suppose it would if one were to insist that the son was an angel in the sense that the author of Hebrews means it, but that's not what I'm necessarily saying.
Oh, I
You
see.
know,
I see what you're
yeah,
saying. So the word angelos, messenger. So it's a
yeah,
different type of messenger. I get it.
right. And I'm not necessarily insisting, at least under the literal pre-existence view, that the son was an angel. Uh, like John, again, John 1 doesn't say angel, says a god, or that's one way of interpreting it. So I just don't see a problem unless one insisted that the pre-existent son was in fact an angel. And
Right.
but I don't know if that's necessarily the case.
Yeah, one of the issues as well is that we say
Mm,
non-Trinitarian, non-pre-existent, we have a big issue also because this figure, this pre-existing
mm,
Son of God, is unusually quiet and hidden
mm,
in the Old Testament.
yeah.
The chapter here in Hebrews 1 opens with this phrase. God,
Hmm.
after he spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets in many portions and or in various ways, in
Right.
these last days he has spoken to us in his son, which suggests, implies, true. But what do you say to that fact that the son was, it looks to be, I mean, for example, Patrick, the word of God, the logos, the var, is not a person in the Old Testament.
Mhm.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not, to my knowledge, presented or portrayed as a literal person. But I see the point that you're making, as, and it's a valid one. In other words, you're saying that in the Old Testament we don't actually find any explicit references to a so-called pre-existent son. You don't really get a lot of, if any, revelation on that particular point, if that's true,
It
if
would
the
be
son existed, right?
right. It would be something that John
Yeah,
gives us for the first time, because
yeah,
it's just not to be found in the
right.
Hebrew scriptures. Let me bring up before the time is upon us here. Sir Anthony here. So I have had the luxury for many years now to have who I call my resident Hebrew and Greek uh, grammar professor. And let's see if I can, Anthony, can you?
Mute that one.
There you go.
Okay, yeah.
Go ahead, Anthony. I think you want to talk about John 1, maybe. I don't know.
Well, yeah,
Can
in
we
the
see
beginning was
you?
a
Can
God.
you
Yeah.
turn your video on?
My start video. How about that? Does that work
There you
now?
go.
Yeah. Well, I'm a language man, you see. I'm hopeless in mathematics, geography, and history. But I come at this as a linguist, having taught languages for many years. I have some unease about pre-existing yourself. Who pre-exists who? And many philosophers and exegetes have wondered that too. The evidence seems to me so complicated. I think I'm probably tired of arguments, you know. And Carlos and you, by the way, are doing a model of good argumentation. But to which of the angels, God never ever, let me paraphrase, God never ever, ever, ever said to any angel, "You're my begotten son." What does begotten son mean? In the womb. That word beget is a creature begotten in the womb. Matthew 1:20 is the son begotten, hiding in your translation, not conceived, begotten. Yanao in Greek, I have to tell you, means to come into existence and to be caused to come into existence. So at least it's very difficult. It's still possible, but very complicated to come into existence or to be caused to come into existence if you're already in existence. That's where I get stuck. I mean, I just think it's too difficult. I used to say to the students, I'll finish with this. Listen, if it's complicated, it's almost certainly wrong. If no translation for 2,000 years in any language ever rendered a God, and you're suggesting some do, but what about in John 1:18? What do you do with the theon there? A God? All right, so a God nobody's ever seen? No, 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 no. Not going to go there. But up in one, you're
Mm.
suggesting you're not actually, because you're being highly reasonable. I congratulate you. But you don't, it's very hard to say that God was a light, God was a love. This is a very reasonable way God does. He turns nouns into adjectives. So the word was Godish, somebody said. Or Williams,
Mm.
even better. The word was God himself. It wasn't somebody else, for goodness sake. That just
Mm.
shrieks at me. Now, I could be just because I'm old and I'm 85 coming on Saturday. I may just be senile. So don't listen to a word I say. I tend to be a bully. My dad was
Oh
that
no,
way too. I don't want to be a bully, but it's
not at all.
easier for me to think that since Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you said this beautifully, are so clear, that which is begot for that very reason in the Greek, theoke. This is precisely why he's the Son of God. Well, of course, whoops, I forgot to tell you, that's not really the reason because he pre-existed. It's just too hard for me.
I appreciate your view. I've followed your writings
Okay, yeah,
and lectures
yeah.
over the years, so
Good,
which is
thank you.
a big part of the reason why
Mhm.
I am and continue to be open to
Yes, you
your
are.
perspective. It's not I'm
Yeah,
not insisting on this particular view
no.
at all. I'm just simply taking a position where unfortunately I do think that there is a degree of complexity and ambiguity on this subject.
Yeah.
Like we just mentioned John 1:18,
Mm,
where as you know, you have the textual variant, and that has a bearing
yes.
on our interpretation of Jesus. As you know,
Hmm.
the
Only
most
begotten God.
right the most ancient manuscripts have, and
Yes,
many translations today will have Jesus presented as an only begotten God.
absolutely.
I think if
Yeah.
I'm understand your position correctly, you prefer the only begotten Son reading,
Well,
but
yes, as actually Hort says, supposing you translate as only begotten God, he said this would be the highest form of created being. I'm stuck
mhm,
with this word begetting.
yeah.
In your system, how do you find a begetting of this logos? First of all, logos never means a person, ever, hundreds of times. But supposing that logos pre-exists, when is he begotten? Today. Let's focus up on that word. Origen says, with God, time is nothing. You see the madness of orthodoxy here. When God says today, he doesn't mean today. Then you're throwing away language. And that's my complaint with much of religion. We break the laws of language. We do a transgender thing sometimes and call hymns its. I'm talking to Christadelphians now about the existence of the devil. And I'm appalled at my Unitarian friends. I want to change them on that to say there's no devil. But these are
Hmm.
50,000 people which suggests to me the groupthink, the mind control thing is very, very great in our business. And no doubt I'm suffering from it myself, but I'm trying to avoid it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I was going to say that we didn't really get,
Mm.
we didn't have too much time to talk about was how what I found a little bit unfortunate and still do to this day is that, you know, for those in our community, what you might call the non-Trinitarian community, you know,
Absolutely.
as you know, we're ostracized from the mainstream religious establishment.
You bet. Like put out of fellowship.
That's
You're not
right.
Christians. You got your hips, narrow hips, Anthony, are going to burn in hell forever.
That's
We are
right.
absolutely hated. The aggression, I don't hate these people, but the aggression with which
Yeah.
they go at our non-Trinitarian thing is
Yes.
terrifying to me. If that's the spirit of Jesus, well, it's a strange spirit that creates you and them.
Right.
I mean, come on, it's hard for
And
me
then
to
we
get
can,
my mind around.
and then we can obviously look at the example of Servetus in the 16th century. We know what happened to him.
John Biddle, you know, dies
That's
for
right,
the
as
rats
well.
running. Something going on here. And this discussion over the devil with a very kindly Christadelphian who has been going for months on this with me. I thought I knew something about the Bible. I didn't. The devil was the serpent. You tell that to a Christadelphian and he goes crazy. Well, it says that. That wasn't just a snake. That was the devil under a figurative term.
Oh, okay.
That is brilliant. I hadn't understood that. So I learn
Right.
everything by dialogue, and I would have a hard time convincing you that the devil is a personification. I would. They're not going to buy that easily. But that's 50,000 people just as bright and reasonable and nice as you are who will put you out of fellowship for that.
That's right.
What's going on here?
Well, that's what I was going to get at, is that what I found to be sort of tragic, though, is the fact that, you know, our community is obviously very small and we are forced to sort of, you know, engage in our own gatherings and conferences and in very small numbers for the most part. And we try to have influence in, you know, in the ways that we do through social media and writing books and conferences and so forth.
That's right.
But I just found it another level of tragedy, if you will, that even among those that sort of recognize that the Trinity is unbiblical, there's even division there when it comes to the pre-existence issue. And some people, I guess, on both camps take a very hard line, if you will. In other words, they go as far as to call into question the Christianity of the opposing side. And that's what I sort of found unfortunate, because as I was telling Carlos, I'm still at a point where I'm not really certain what the correct conclusion is on that. But I see authentic Christian spirituality among those with differing views. So
I do too.
So
I do with lots of good people.
Yes.
With Mormons. So
yeah,
what am I going to do now?
Even among Trinitarians
I struggle with
myself.
this, that to use the phrase, you know, I struggle with it every day. On the one hand, you read, if you twist the scriptures, you're doing it to your own apolia, destruction.
Yeah.
Don't do it. Oh, but Anthony, that's doctrine which divides. What counts is Christian living. False dichotomy. I see Jesus saying you've got to love the truth, or Paul saying, if you don't love the truth, then you're going to be given over to a spirit of delusion to believe lies. Well, I think the Christadelphians have embraced a lie and defending it. And if I don't warn them, I feel I'm guilty. You know, so what do you do? But this is an ongoing struggle in one's mind, you know, as to how to work all that.
Absolutely. So this is why I appreciate this conversation.
Thanks, Anthony, for your input.
I think I'd leave you with the word genao is to cause to come into existence. I don't think you can be caused to come into existence if you already exist. At least it's problematic.
Well, actually, while you're here, Anthony, let me ask you quickly, Patrick. Those points, you know, just for the sake of the audience. So the point about Matthew 1:1, the language of origin, the genesis of the Messiah happened this way. And then Anthony alluding to Luke 1:30 to 35, the Son of God procreated in the womb. So how do you circumvent those, you know, that very, to us, explicit language of an origin, you know, a begetting, a procreation,
Yeah.
in the womb and not outside, I guess, the
But
womb.
he really doesn't, because he's being so reasonable. I
Oh, right.
sense in you
I'm
an
using him
open-mindedness that you didn't always
as
have.
the pre-existence point of view. How do they?
How do they?
I
Yeah.
think that in the pre-existence view would accept those texts, but simply make the point that yes, that was the beginning of the man Jesus, that was the
Yes.
origin of the human Jesus. But in that view, that doesn't necessarily preclude this spiritual
Right.
pre-human existence. I think that would be the answer to
Right.
that from that perspective.
Yes. I
In other
see
words,
that.
not necessarily seeing an absolute conflict between the two.
J.W. said that God put the memory of being Michael
Mhm.
back on Jesus at his baptism. That to me is desperation. What?
S-
Where does it say that? Oh, by
Certainly,
the way, I just remembered I was Michael. Oh, well,
right.
Michael is an archangel, not an angel.
Okay,
I
right.
think those JW, I love the JWs. They're so impassioned. We're winning people, by the way, from them. And they bring their fervor and excitement over what they learn to be truth. They're bringing it to this view now. But
Right.
at the door, here, let me be the snob. If you don't have any training in the languages professionally, no peer review, be careful at some level. You just don't have the feel for the meaning of words if you haven't ever had to go through the peer review thing in a school. I'm not saying you have to go to school, but it doesn't hurt to have some official training in language, because
That's
you
true.
gain a sort of a sense. You can still be wrong. So there's nothing to do with that, but maybe there's some factor there.
Absolutely.
All
Absolutely.
right. All right. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
watching.
Nice to see you, and
Congratulations.
happy
Great.
anniversary, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yes.
50 years. Where's that gone? I mean, that's crazy. You'll be there soon.
Congratulations to you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anthony. All right. That was Sir Anthony.
So, Carl, I have one text I was curious if you
Yes.
would
Go ahead.
address. Again, not in
Please.
the spirit of
No.
debating, but this is just one particular text or a comparison of text that I have found interesting and have not really ever heard anyone speak to it.
Not
And,
even us.
maybe you've seen this point because I shared with you this paper before, but I just don't recall ever hearing any discussion on that on this
Sure.
text. But it's in that paper that I sent to you on point number 8. But to me, this is an example where I can see a fair argument, let's say, on both sides of the pre-existence issue. As you know, there's quite a number of expressions especially in the Gospel of John, where Jesus talks about coming from above, or I have come down from heaven. And I do remember, I think from Anthony's writings, where he had pointed out how James, he uses that language of every good and perfect gift comes from above, coming down from the Father of lights. And he reasonably makes the point that, well, when the scriptures speak about things coming from above, or you could say coming from heaven, that type of language, that doesn't necessarily imply the notion of, literally being in heaven and coming down to the earth. And that makes a great deal of sense. And I think that's a very reasonable way of sort of looking at these come down from heaven texts on the part of Jesus. And the other point that could be made is where Jesus makes a reference to the baptism of John the Baptist, and I think he poses the question, was John's baptism from men, or is it from heaven? I think he says, or from above. And so obviously John's baptism, he didn't mean that. In other words, the language that he used in reference to John's baptism didn't imply that his baptism was somehow in heaven and came down to the earth. But the idea is that its origin was from God. It was authorized by God. God was the one behind the baptism. Anyways, the point is, I recognize those points, and I think it's a very fair and very reasonable way to interpret the language Jesus used when he speaks about coming down from heaven. But this is what I wanted to just ask you about. Where in John 3:13 and also in 6:38, he makes a similar expression, and you can even pull it up on your screen if you want.
Sure.
But he says in John 3:13, no one has ascended into heaven except he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. And in my paper, I called attention to the Greek expression ektu uranu katabas, literally out of the heaven I came down. What's interesting about that to me, and you can also compare it to the similar language in 6:38, I believe it is how in Matthew 28, in reference to the angel that appears at the tomb of Jesus. So so I'm basically trying to compare John 3:13, the language there, with the language that's used of the angel in Matthew 28. Matthew 28:2, which says, "And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it." And I called attention also to the Greek, agalos gar kurio katabas ek uranu. So if you compare those two texts, that coming down from heaven language that Jesus uses of himself, and that Matthew uses in reference to the angel, as anyone can see, the language is essentially identical. And the point that I'm making is that on the one hand, I can see the reasonableness of interpreting Jesus's coming down from heaven language in the way that you would. In other words, not to mean that he literally lived in heaven and sort of fell from the sky, if you will, and literally lived in heaven and came down to the earth. In other words, I see that as reasonable. And if you consider the language of James, every good and perfect gift comes from above. So what I'm saying is, my point is that simply that I see the reasonableness of that, but on the other hand, I look at the language of Jesus coming down out of heaven, which he uses of himself, but notice that that same type of language is used of the angel in Matthew 28. It's pretty much identical language. It uses that same word, that Greek verb katabino. And so I think that most of us would interpret that to mean that the angel did in fact live in the heavenly realm, if you will. He left the heavenly realm and made it an appearance on the earth. So the point that I'm making, that I think you can see, is that it's interesting that Jesus uses that coming down out of heaven language. Matthew uses it of the angel, which I think most of us would interpret in a more or less literal sense, meaning that the angel left the heavenly domain, came to the earthly domain. So I guess what do you think of that? In other words, can you see how one can reasonably make the argument that, well, if that language is used of the angel coming down out of heaven, which seems to mean that he lived in heaven, left heaven, came to the earth, Jesus uses the same language in reference to himself. It just seems to me I could see a reasonable case can be made to interpret Jesus along those more or less literal lines of an actual heavenly preexistence.
Well, that's why we have, what is it, 1 billion Trinitarians?
Mm-hmm.
Because they rely a lot on this type of argumentation. So we have a thing that I think my wife came up with this, you know, shared titles and shared imagery, right? And even shared functions doesn't equal the equal sign, right?
Okay.
So for example, my point is that the Trinitarian says, or the person who believes Jesus is God, right?
Yeah.
They say, well, look, Jesus is called this and Jesus did that. God is called this and God does that, right?
Okay.
That gives you the second person of the Trinity.
Right.
No, what that gives me is what is that? Is that a fallacy? It's not. It doesn't follow, right?
Right.
Now, I think
So
this
you're
is
sort of recognizing that the language is essentially identical,
sure,
but in your view, that doesn't
right?
necessarily mean that they should be interpreted in the same way.
Exactly. As you know, I mean, this is a classic exegesis, right? It depends on the context, it depends on the subject, and so on. So obviously, an angel lives in heaven, right? Comes from heaven, and just because you have things coming down from heaven, does that? A good example of the coming down, as you know, is the bread, the manna. Did that literally come out of heaven? Some people think it literally came out from heaven, but it didn't. It did not. If you go back and you read the Old Testament story, It just says it appears. It
Mhm.
appeared in the morning,
Okay.
right?
But
It didn't. No one saw it coming down literally from heaven, did they?
but it came from heaven in the sense that its origin was with God.
Right.
Right.
So,
But you do agree that the language of the angel coming down from heaven does mean that the angel was in heaven and came to the earth.
it's like saying rain fell.
Mhm.
You know, rain fell down from heaven. I mean, again, this is shared language, but again, it has to do with the subject you're talking about. Again, I don't believe Jesus was an angel or a god or a celestial being that pre-existed in heaven and literally came down. For example, you wouldn't use this argument. I hope you wouldn't anyway. Like the Trinitarians often do. They go to John 6. Well, look, in John 6, Jesus says he came down out of heaven. What more do you have? Uh, what more do you want? Well, look at the context. Okay, true. It says he came down out of heaven in the flesh.
Mhm.
I mean, that should be a problem for the person arguing. So let me get to that
Sure.
question. Your question, you're asking a question that is interesting. I heard one of our fellow Trinitarian apologists out there who shall remain nameless, but he made a very interesting point. He asked a very interesting question. He said, look, I'll show you this text. Look at a text like John 16:28, he says.
Mm.
It says, Jesus says, I came out from God. I came out of God, right? And I came into the world. Now I leave the world and I'm going to the Father. Okay. The question was, well, you non-Trinitarians say that the first part of this saying is metaphorical, it's figurative language, right? But then you say that the last section of this verse is literal. He literally, right, ascended to heaven. Isn't that, isn't that a bad way of doing biblical exegesis? Now, I thought about this. That was actually an interesting point. I don't know if you've heard that one, right?
That
And
a Trinitarian was making to you.
to someone else, not me.
Oh,
I
oh.
heard this in
Yeah.
an exchange. I had never heard that, right? And I thought about it, and I thought about it. It took some thinking, but then I said to myself, well, Jesus did come out of the Father. In what way did he, not in a figurative sense, but in a real sense, did he come from the Father?
Mhm.
Because the Father begat him. The
Mhm.
Father procreated him. So then when you look at the language of ek, which you're talking about, right, out of,
Right.
ek to patros, right, out of the Father. I'm using the modern English, by the way, not the Erasmian English. So then you look at a text like Matthew 1:20. It says ek from the Spirit.
Mhm.
You see that?
Oh, yes.
Ek from the Spirit. So in a very real sense, Christ says, I came from the Father, and in a real sense, he went to the Father. And then you have the coming into the world, going out of the world. Actually, I found this quote quite educational years ago. This is from the famous Ladd, A Theology of the New Testament. He says, it's a Jewish idiom, coming into the world, being in the world, departing out of the world is familiar Jewish terminology. To come into the world means merely to be born, to be in the world, to exist. To depart or go out from the world is to die. And this is from, as far as I know, a very famous evangelical, I think,
Mm.
G.E. Ladd. So again, these are things about Hebraism, idioms, depending on the subject. Yes, the language is similar with the angel. Sure, angels come down from heaven. The bread was said to come down from heaven. The gifts, good, gifts are, but again, it's a matter of, it's this false analogies I hear a lot, especially with I've been debating a lot. I don't know if you've been watching, but it's always the same. Well, Jesus is called this, he shares that, he looks like this. God.
Mhm.
So to me, it's not analogous. It doesn't follow. I hope that helps.
Yeah, sure.
All right, so we're coming upon the time. How are we doing with time? We good?
Yeah, I have like 15 minutes left before I
15
got to
minutes. Let's make
wrap it
them
up.
count. There was a question on YouTube. Thanks everyone. We have about 40 people watching on YouTube. Let's see. About Genesis 1:26, Patrick. Do you believe that Jesus was there? You know, the famous "Let us"
Oh,
verses in Genesis. What's your
I think it's
personal belief?
possible if one assumes that the Son pre-existed. If that's the case, I'm not. Again, my view is not that that's absolutely the case, but I'm open to the possibility. The text itself just doesn't identify who the us is. A lot of Jewish commentators think that God is addressing the heavenly court, the angels that were um, present in the heavenly realm with God when that happened. Some interpret it as as the royal we, or let us. That "let us" language is a kind of a figure of speech. So I see it as possible as a reference to the Son, but that's only under the assumption that Jesus did have a literal pre-existence and was with God when those creative works were taking place.
When was the Son begotten?
When was the Son begotten? Well, as you pointed out, is it Matthew and Luke or both? That language of begotten definitely occurs. Um, Others would argue that based on an interpretation of Colossians 1:15, the language of firstborn of all creation, that Jesus or the Son was born or begotten of God before God created all things through him. So some would see that firstborn of creation language as a reference to Jesus coming into existence or being born of God before the creation and before the human birth.
Mm-hmm. Uh, let's see. One last question, Patrick, and I'll let you go. Let's see. Let me see for you. Is there a way for you to break? I'm trying to phrase this in a way. Is there a way for you to break the agnostic tie that you have between pre-existence or no pre-existence? Is there any other place where you might look to find that tiebreaker? Is it historically or otherwise?
Probably if I just keep hanging out with Carlos and Anthony, it'll eventually happen. The more I hang out with them, the closer I get.
Yeah, careful. What's that saying about the friends? Be careful of friends you run with, or
Is
else.
it bad company spoils
Yeah,
morals or something
something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, Patrick, I'll let you go. Thanks a lot. It's been a while. I haven't seen you in 2008, I think it was last time, 2008, 2000. So I hope we can do this again. I know you're a busy guy, but thanks for doing this.
Oh, definitely. Thank you for having me on, and it's good to see you, even though it's virtual. But that's the new trend with
Yep,
the quarantine COVID-19 crisis.
it's a brave new world.
Absolutely.
All right, buddy.
Thanks for
Thanks a
having me
lot.
on. Stay in
Okay,
touch.
good night.